Commander Jeremiah Denton sits tied to a heavy wooden chair in a dim room in Hanoi. It is May of 1966 and the air is stiflingly hot. The bright lights of television cameras glare into his tired eyes while North Vietnamese officers stand in the shadows. They demand he denounce the United States government and admit to war crimes he did not commit. He blinks his eyes in a strange and rhythmic pattern as he speaks. He spells out the word torture in Morse code. This act of defiance is broadcast around the world and confirms the brutal treatment of American prisoners. He risks severe punishment to send this truth home. The experience of a prisoner of war is one of the most harrowing ordeals a human being can endure. It is a state of existence where freedom is stripped away and life hangs by a fragile thread. Soldiers are trained to fight and to kill, but few are truly prepared for the helplessness of captivity. They face starvation and disease and the constant threat of execution at the hands of their captors. The rules of war are often ignored in the shadows of prison camps. Survival becomes a daily battle not against an enemy army on the field, but against despair and the deterioration of the mind and body. Throughout the history of the United States, countless men have found themselves behind the wire. Their stories are not just tales of suffering, but also of incredible ingenuity and brotherhood. From the rotting hulks of British prison ships to the jungle camps of Southeast Asia, the spirit of the American soldier has been tested. They created secret codes to communicate and built hidden radios to hear news from home. They shared meager rations to keep the weakest among them alive for one more day. This documentary explores the darkness of their confinement and the unbreakable light of their resilience. During the American Revolutionary War, the prospect of capture was often a death sentence. The British forces did not have enough space to house the thousands of Continental Army soldiers they captured. They turned to using decommissioned warships anchored in Wallabout Bay near New York City. These floating dungeons were known as prison ships, and the most notorious among them was the HMS Jersey. It was a rotting old hulk that had been stripped of its masts and converted into a holding facility. The ship was dark and damp and infested with vermin that carried deadly diseases like yellow fever and smallpox. More Americans died on these prison ships than in all the battles of the Revolutionary War combined. The prisoners were packed below decks in total darkness with no fresh air to breathe. The heat in the summer was unbearable and the cold in the winter was biting. They were given moldy bread and meat that was unfit for consumption. Each morning the guards would yell down into the hold to ask how many rebels were dead. The bodies were brought up and thrown into the bay or buried in shallow graves along the muddy shoreline. It was a grim testament to the cost of liberty. 80 years later, the American Civil War brought the horror of captivity to a massive scale. Both the Union and the Confederacy were unprepared for the sheer number of prisoners they would take. The exchange system that had allowed prisoners to return home broke down in 1863. This led to massive overcrowding in camps that were never designed to hold so many men. The most infamous of these was Camp Sumter, which is better known as Andersonville. Located deep in Georgia, it became a symbol of the suffering endured by Union soldiers. The camp was an open stockade with no shelter from the elements. The conditions at Andersonville were apocalyptic. A small stream called Sweetwater Creek flowed through the camp and served as the only water source. It quickly became clogged with human waste and filth from the thousands of men living on its banks. Disease ran rampant through the population, and scurvy caused men's teeth to fall out. There was no wood for fires, so men dug holes in the ground to try and escape the scorching sun and the freezing rain. They huddled together for warmth and comfort while watching their friends waste away from starvation. The guards in the towers shot anyone who crossed the deadline. The man in charge of Andersonville was Captain Henry Wurz. He was a Swiss-born Confederate officer who struggled to maintain order in the chaos. Supplies in the South were running low, and there was little food available for the Confederate Army, let alone for prisoners. Wurz was vilified in the North as a monster who deliberately starved his captives. After the war ended, he was one of the few people executed for war crimes during the Civil War. Historians still debate whether he was a villain or a scapegoat for a system that had completely collapsed under the weight of war. Inside the stockade at Andersonville, the prisoners faced threats from within their own ranks. A group of Union prisoners known as the Raiders terrorized their fellow soldiers. They stole food and blankets and murdered men for their meager possessions. The situation became so desperate that the other prisoners formed a group called the Regulators to fight back. They held a trial inside the prison camp and sentenced the leaders of the Raiders to death. The Confederate commandant allowed them to carry out the hanging. It was a brutal example of how the social contract survives even in hell. By the time the war ended, nearly 13,000 men had died at Andersonville. The survivors resembled walking skeletons with hollow eyes and tattered rags for clothes. Clara Barton, the famous nurse who founded the American Red Cross, came to the site to help identify the dead. She worked tirelessly to mark the graves and ensure that the families knew what happened to their loved ones. The legacy of Andersonville led to new discussions about the treatment of prisoners of war. It showed the world that neglect could be just as deadly as a bullet or a bayonet. The 20th century brought global conflict and a new scale of imprisonment. In World War II, the Pacific Theater presented a unique horror for Allied prisoners. The Japanese military culture viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. Soldiers who were captured were seen as having no honor and were treated with extreme brutality. This clash of cultures led to some of the worst atrocities in the history of warfare. When the American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula surrendered in 1942, they were forced into a grueling journey that became known as the Bataan Death March. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to walk over 60 miles in the blistering tropical heat. They were given no food or water and were beaten if they slowed down or fell out of line. Japanese guards bayoneted men who collapsed from exhaustion or dehydration. The roads were lined with the bodies of those who could not keep up. Local Filipino civilians tried to throw food to the passing soldiers, but were often shot for their kindness. It was a march of absolute misery that tested the limits of human endurance. Survival depended on putting one foot in front of the other. Those who survived the march were herded into Camp O'Donnell. The conditions there were hardly better than on the road. Dysentery and malaria killed hundreds of men every day. The prisoners were forced to bury their dead in mass graves while weak from hunger. Despite the horror, small acts of resistance kept their spirits alive. Doctors worked without medicine to save lives, and chaplains offered prayers to comfort the dying. The bond between the soldiers grew stronger as they shared the burden of their captivity. They promised each other that they would survive to see their families again. Across the globe in the European theater, the experience was different but still dangerous. The Germans generally followed the Geneva Convention for American and British prisoners, but escape was always on the minds of the captives. Stalag Luft III was a camp designed specifically for Allied airmen. It was built on sandy soil to make tunneling difficult, but that did not stop the prisoners. Under the leadership of Roger Bushell, they launched one of the most audacious escape plans in history. They began digging 3 massive tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. The ingenuity of the prisoners at Stalag Luft III was astounding. They forged identity papers and sewed civilian clothes out of blankets. They built air pumps from tin cans to ventilate the tunnels and created a wooden trolley system to move dirt. They dispersed the excavated soil by carrying it in bags inside their trousers and shaking it out around the camp. This operation required the cooperation of hundreds of men who worked in total secrecy. They knew that discovery meant severe punishment, but the hope of freedom drove them forward. The Great Escape was about to begin. On a moonless night in March 1944, the escape commenced. The tunnel Harry had reached beyond the perimeter fence but fell short of the woods. The men had to crawl out under the nose of a guard tower. 76 men managed to escape before the alarm was raised. It was a massive embarrassment for the German High Command. A massive manhunt was launched across occupied Europe to find the fugitives. Most were recaptured within days. In a tragic turn of events, 50 of the escapees were executed by the Gestapo on the orders of Adolf Hitler. Another legendary location in Europe was Colditz Castle. This fortress sat high on a cliff and was used to house prisoners who had escaped from other camps. The Germans believed it was escape-proof, but the Allied officers took that as a challenge. They built gliders in the attic and sewed uniforms to impersonate German officers. Pat Reed was one of the famous escapees who managed to slip away and make it to neutral Switzerland. The stories from Colditz became legendary and showcased the wit and determination of the Allied officers. They turned the prison into a battleground of wits. The Korean War introduced a terrifying new psychological weapon known as brainwashing. American prisoners captured by the Chinese and North Koreans were subjected to intense political indoctrination. They were isolated from their leaders and forced to attend long lectures on communism. The captors used a system of rewards and punishments to break down their resistance. They tried to turn the prisoners against their own country and against each other. This was a war for the mind. The goal was not just to imprison the body, but to capture the soul. The Tiger Death March in Korea remains one of the most brutal episodes of that war. Under the command of a North Korean major known as the Tiger, hundreds of American prisoners were marched north in freezing conditions. Men who could not keep up were shot instantly. The temperature dropped well below zero, and many men froze to death in their sleep. Among the heroes of this ordeal was Father Emil Capon. He was an army chaplain who stole food for the starving and carried the wounded. He died in captivity, but his selfless actions saved hundreds of lives. The Vietnam War brought the longest period of captivity for American prisoners. Pilots shot down over North Vietnam were taken to prisons in and around Hanoi. The most famous of these was Hoa Lo Prison, which the Americans ironically nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton. The treatment there was barbaric. The North Vietnamese refused to classify them as prisoners of war and instead called them air pirates. This allowed them to ignore the Geneva Convention. Torture was used systematically to extract military information and propaganda statements. The men were kept in solitary confinement for years. James Stockdale was the senior ranking officer at the Hanoi Hilton. He was a Navy pilot who understood that leadership was vital for survival. He established a chain of command within the prison despite the isolation. Stockdale physically beat his own face with a stool to prevent his captors from using him in a propaganda film. He slit his wrists to show them that he would choose death over submission. His incredible bravery set the standard for the other prisoners. He taught them that they were still soldiers at war even while in chains. Communication was the key to sanity in the Hanoi Hilton. The men were kept in separate cells with thick concrete walls. They developed a tap code based on a 5x5 grid of the alphabet. They tapped on the walls and the pipes to talk to each other. They shared names of new prisoners and news from the outside world. They told jokes and taught each other languages and mathematics. This tap code became their lifeline. It proved that the enemy could lock them up, but could not stop them from being a united force. The Alcatraz 11 were a group of the most resistant prisoners in Vietnam. They included men like Jeremiah Denton and James Stockdale. The North Vietnamese separated them from the main population and moved them to a special facility. They were kept in tiny concrete boxes with leg irons and were tortured relentlessly. The captors tried to break the leadership of the POWs by isolating these key figures. Instead, the resistance of the Alcatraz 11 became a legend among the other prisoners. Their suffering only strengthened the resolve of the men they left behind. One of the most difficult challenges for the prisoners was the lack of news from home. For years, their families did not know if they were dead or alive. Sybil Stockdale, the wife of James Stockdale, organized the wives of other prisoners. They lobbied the United States government to go public with the evidence of torture. Their efforts forced the issue into the spotlight and put pressure on the North Vietnamese. The courage of the families back home mirrored the courage of the men in the camps. It was a joint struggle for truth and safe return. Operation Homecoming in 1973 finally brought the prisoners back. Giant transport planes landed in Hanoi to pick up the men. They marched out in formation with their heads held high. They had endured years of brutality, but they had not been broken. The images of their return are etched in the American memory. They stepped off the planes and saluted the flag. Families were reunited on the tarmac in tearful embraces. It was the end of a long, dark chapter, but the scars of captivity would remain with them forever. The legacy of these prisoners of war goes far beyond the history books. They taught the military valuable lessons about survival and resistance. The code of conduct for the United States Armed Forces was updated based on their experiences. It emphasizes the duty to escape and the obligation to keep faith with fellow prisoners. Training programs were developed to prepare soldiers for the psychological stress of capture. The suffering of the past was used to protect the soldiers of the future. Their sacrifice was not in vain. Resilience is the common thread that binds these stories together. Whether in the hull of a wooden ship or a concrete cell in Hanoi, the human spirit refuses to be extinguished. The prisoners found strength in their identity and in their loyalty to one another. They discovered that the mind can endure pain that the body cannot. They proved that dignity is something that comes from within and cannot be taken away by force. Their stories stand as a testament to the power of hope in the darkest of places. Many former prisoners of war went on to achieve great things after their release. Jeremiah Denton became a United States Senator. James Stockdale became a vice presidential candidate and a scholar of philosophy. They used their second chance at life to serve their country in new ways. They carried the burden of their memories but did not let it define them. They showed that it is possible to heal from trauma and to find purpose after tragedy. They are the ultimate examples of post-traumatic growth. Today we honor the memory of all those who were held captive. We remember the thousands who lie in unmarked graves in foreign lands. We remember those who returned home with invisible wounds that never fully healed. The prisoner of war flag flies below the American flag at federal buildings to ensure they are never forgotten. It is a black silhouette against a white background with a guard tower and barbed wire. The words "You are not forgotten" are emblazoned below. It is a solemn promise from a grateful nation. The story of the prisoner of war is a difficult one to tell. It forces us to confront the cruelty that humans are capable of inflicting on one another. But it also forces us to recognize the incredible capacity for survival. It asks us what we would do in their place. Would we have the strength to tap a code on a wall? Would we have the courage to blink the truth into a camera lens? These men faced the abyss and stared it down. They are the whispers of time that remind us of the price of freedom. As the sun sets on the old battlefields, the camps are now quiet. Andersonville is a peaceful park with green grass covering the earth that once knew only misery. The Hanoi Hilton is a museum visited by tourists. The physical walls have crumbled or changed, but the history remains. We must listen to the voices of the past to understand the value of the present. The prisoners of war endured the unendurable so that we might live in liberty. Their silent resilience echoes through the generations. In the end, the story is not about the torture or the bars. It is about the triumph of the human will. It is about the refusal to surrender one's humanity. It is about the love of country and the love of comrades. From the Revolutionary War to the jungles of Vietnam, the American prisoner of war has stood tall. They walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged with their honor intact. We salute them not just as victims of war, but as victors over despair. The next time you see a flag waving in the wind, take a moment to remember. Remember the men who watched the seasons change through the cracks in a wooden wall. Remember the men who dreamed of a simple meal while starving in the cold. Remember the men who never came back. Their sacrifice is woven into the fabric of the nation. They are the guardians of a profound truth. Freedom is fragile and it is defended by the brave. We owe them an eternal debt of gratitude. Let their stories be a beacon for us all. When we face our own struggles and our own moments of darkness, we can look to them for inspiration. We can find strength in their example. We can remember that no matter how difficult the situation, there is always hope. There is always a way to endure. There is always a way to keep faith. The prisoners of war have shown us the way. They have shown us what it truly means to be free. We close this chapter of history with a final thought on their endurance. The chains could bind their hands, but never their hearts. The walls could block the sun, but never the light of their spirit. They were prisoners in body only. In their minds and in their souls, they remained free men. This is the ultimate victory. This is the whisper of time that will never fade. Survival is the greatest act of defiance.